Hey guys, tonight we wander into a sun-baked landscape where golden sands ripple like liquid amber under a sky so wide it feels infinite. You trudge barefoot, or almost barefoot, because even sand this fine has a way of sneaking between toes toward the clay ovens clustered like sleeping animals in a distant Nubian village. The smell of dry earth mingles with the faint tang of river water, the scent of life clinging stubbornly to the desert. You probably won't survive this, at least not without a bit of sweat and dust, but tonight, that's exactly the adventure we're signing up for. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, why not post your location and local time in the comments? I love seeing where in the world we're tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The day begins early, long before the sun climbs above the horizon in its lazy sweep across the desert. You watch as bakers gather clay from riverbanks, scraping it with calloused fingers, eyes half closed against the morning glare. There's a ritual to this work, a rhythm to scraping, patting, and shaping that feels almost meditative. Historians still argue whether the design of these ovens, hemispherical, shallow, and low, was purely functional or influenced by ritualistic traditions, but from where you stand, the distinction barely matters. Each oven is a promise of soft, warm bread at daybreak, a comfort against the merciless dryness that threatens to crack skin and spirit alike. You crouch near one oven, feeling the residual heat from last night's baking. The air smells faintly of smoke and mineral-rich clay, a scent so grounding it almost hushes the world around you. A baker, older than the dunes themselves it seems, runs a hand over the oven's dome, patting it gently as if coaxing it to wake. The clay cracks slightly under his palm, tiny fissures that, when repaired, will trap heat with almost magical efficiency. You note that even the most advanced modern ovens sometimes struggle to maintain a consistent temperature as subtle as this. Fringe studies suggest they might have added crushed grains or even animal hair to the clay mix, an idea historians debate and snack on with both skepticism and fascination. The village slowly stirs. Children chase one another with woven baskets, the occasional shout ricocheting off low mud walls. You can hear the river murmuring somewhere beyond the dunes, a constant, patient companion. And while the day hasn't fully begun, the smell of grinding grain, of water mixed with flour, begins to drift toward you. This is the prelude, the quiet overture before dough is kneaded and loaves are shaped, before the desert heat presses down with unrelenting insistence. Here, preparation is everything, because in a climate that punishes softness, even a minor misstep can leave bread as dry and unforgiving as the sand itself. You notice the subtle ways bakers interact with the sand beneath their feet. They sometimes sprinkle a tiny layer around oven bases, insulating it against rapid cooling. Historians still argue whether this was accidental or intentional experimentation passed down through generations. Nearby, a small boy tends a cluster of millet stalks drying in the sun, waving lazily at you, the golden grains rustling like distant applause. You catch a glint of water in a low jug, an oasis of life in a landscape that rarely offers it willingly. And so the ritual begins. Clay is smoothed, ovens checked for tiny cracks, grains gathered and inspected with meticulous care. You feel yourself slipping into the rhythm, the quiet hum of the village blending with your own breath. Even as the sun begins to rise, the day's heat is tempered by the steady, grounding work of preparation. You realize that somehow the softest bread in the harshest desert is not the result of any single secret ingredient or sudden brilliance, but the patient accumulation of countless small gestures, repeated day after day, century after century. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen your cousin joked about last week? Well, here too, there are mixtures and textures that might seem strange or fringe, but hold their own wisdom. Dust from riverbeds, bits of crushed clay, and water measured drop by drop create a backdrop against which flour will transform, ferment, and eventually yield loaves that defy the desert itself. Even scholars are split on which factor mattered most, the clay oven's heat, the grain selection, or the water rituals. For now, you let the questions drift like loose sand. The important part is being here, sensing the meticulous, slow dance that makes bread soft in a place determined to harden everything it touches. By the time the sun is fully awake, the village is alive with a muted clatter. Hands patting, grinding, whispering directions, even a few muted jokes about yesterday's too-hot batch. You trudge alongside the bakers, noticing every small movement, the way fingers scoop flour into a gentle mound, how lids are placed to trap precious heat, the slight tilt of an oven that optimizes airflow. All these details, almost invisible, collectively protect softness in a place that wants nothing but toughness. You step closer to a line of grain sacks, their coarse textures rough against your fingertips, and realize that this moment, selecting the right grain, is almost a ceremony in itself. Millet glows pale like the first light of dawn. Sorghum beads are glossy and dark, and emmer wheat lies somewhere between, modest but reliable. You lift a handful, letting it cascade through your fingers like liquid gold, feeling weight, shape, and texture. Each kernel holds the promise of softness, a tiny vessel of history and survival. Historians still argue whether the Nubians' choice of specific grains mattered more for taste or for structural resilience against desert heat. But standing here, that distinction seems almost irrelevant. The tactile satisfaction alone is mesmerizing. The bakers approach the task with a quiet reverence. You watch as they inspect grains against the sunlight, tilting their heads, squinting, murmuring a soft, rhythmic counting. Fringe tidbits from old texts suggest some grains were even soaked in river water for a few hours before grinding, a method debated in modern scholarship, but thought to influence fermentation subtly. You lift a tiny scoop and smell it, earthy, warm, and faintly sweet, a scent that promises bread that will not crumble like dry sand under your hands. You notice tiny rituals woven into the process. One baker hums softly, and another swirls grains in a shallow basket to let the wind carry away lighter husks. You join in the motion, feeling the wind tug gently at your sleeves, scattering bits of chaff into the air. This is more than preparation. It is a gentle choreography, centuries in the making. And somehow, the simplicity of it, the unassuming attention to detail, is what produces loaves that remain soft hours after baking. At the edge of the village, you see sacks marked with curious symbols, circles, zigzags, and tiny dots. Some scholars argue that these symbols denote origin, quality, or even intended use, while others suggest that they were part of early mystical thinking about food and energy. You tilt a sack and tap the grains inside. The sound is subtle, satisfying, a dull, hollow whisper, like the distant echo of river water bouncing off sandstone. French historians even speculate that the Nubians might have chosen grains not purely for taste or texture, but by resonance when tapped, a theory you can't quite decide to believe or chuckle at. The grinding stage awaits, but before that, the water used to wash or soak the grains is carefully measured. You notice a shallow pool nearby, sunlight dancing off its surface. Water is precious here, and even a slight miscalculation could transform a soft, supple dough into something that cracks before you can lift it. Some bakers dip fingers into the water, feeling temperature and mineral content, adjusting quantities accordingly. You splash a little on your wrist, instantly aware that even the tiniest detail has consequences in a desert environment. Historians still argue whether certain water rituals were purely practical or carried hidden symbolic meaning. You kneel beside a small heap of sorghum, noting its consistency. A gentle press between your palms reveals subtle differences. Some grains yield easily, others resist. The bakers explain, though you barely need their words, that each grain interacts differently with water, heat, and fermentation. They've learned through generations which combinations result in the softest bread. Fringe anecdotes mention sprinkling crushed seeds from a local desert plant to slightly aerate the grain, though proof remains elusive. The effect is subtle, but standing here, your senses alert, You almost believe you can feel the difference between a loaf that will stay tender and one that won't. Carrying sacks across the sun-baked ground, you notice how color and weight guide choices. Pale millet is prized for breakfast bread, lighter and sweeter, while darker sorghum is often reserved for longer-lasting loaves or ceremonial use. You lift a sack to inspect it, noting tiny imperfections, imagining the gentle hum of wind as it moves across a field somewhere upstream. The subtle differences in kernels might seem minor, but they shape texture, flavor, and resilience in ways that modern machines cannot replicate. Scholars debate whether the Nubians consciously understood these differences or if generations of trial and error simply codified tradition into instinct. As the sun climbs higher, the village moves like a slow, breathing organism. Hands sift, shake, and measure. Dust motes float in shafts of sunlight like tiny stars caught mid-flight. You trudge alongside, letting the ritual guide your movements. Even the children, now tasked with moving smaller sacks or dusting off grains, participate in the slow, deliberate dance. Fringe accounts whisper that some grains were briefly left in the moonlight before grinding, believed to affect fermentation, a notion historians treat skeptically, but charmingly nonetheless. By midday, you're surrounded by heaps of carefully selected grains, each type destined for a particular dough, a particular oven, a particular moment in the day's slow choreography. The grains glint faintly under the sun, almost teasing you with the promise of the softness to come. The air hums with potential, and you realize that this selection phase is not merely about practicality. It is about coaxing life and tenderness from a landscape that rarely yields either. Every scoop, every swirl of grains, every measured gesture, you notice, is imbued with centuries of wisdom. You pause, running fingers over a heap of millet, letting the grains slip slowly through your hands, imagining the generations of bakers who did exactly the same thing. And in that simple, quiet act, you begin to understand. The foundation of Nubian soft bread is not just the flour or water, but the patience, reverence, and rhythm that shape it long before it touches fire.
You bend closer to the grinding stones, the coarse surface rough against your palms, and realize that here begins the transformation. Grain becomes flour, and flour becomes the very promise of soft bread. The stones are massive yet intimate, each with a history etched into its surface, pockmarks, grooves, and faint scratches that whisper stories of countless mornings and centuries of rhythm. Historians still argue whether these early grinding techniques were intentionally designed for texture or simply evolved through trial and error, but standing here, you feel the answer in your fingertips. You place a handful of millet against the lower stone, pressing gently as the upper stone rolls forward. The grains crush, releasing a faintly nutty scent that hangs in the air. Fringe records hint that some bakers added a pinch of river sand to the mix, a delicate abrasive to aid grinding. Scholars debate whether this was standard practice or an experimental quirk, but you lift the flour dust, letting it drift lazily in the sunbeams cutting through the kitchen smoke, and inhale. It's earthy, a little sweet, and hints at the life still trapped within these tiny kernels. Grinding is not just physical, it is sensory, meditative even. You feel the vibration under your palms, hear the subtle rasping whisper of grains breaking, and taste the faint grit clinging to your tongue. Children watch nearby, giggling as tiny clouds of flour drift into their hair, and you almost forget the relentless desert sun pressing down. You press again, rotating the stone, noting the subtle differences in pressure, angle, and timing that subtly alter the texture of the flour. Fringe anecdotes even suggest that some bakers tapped the stone rhythmically, believing that vibrations improved texture, a claim historians treat with gentle skepticism, though it sounds almost believable. Sifting follows grinding, a gentle choreography designed to separate fine flour from husks. You scoop handfuls into baskets and lift them high, letting wind and gravity do the work. Fine particles fall slowly, almost floating, while coarser bits stay behind. You notice a husky aroma as bran separates, and the bakers explain, without ceremony but with infinite patience, that the finer the flour, the softer the resulting bread. Historians still argue whether ancient Nubians deliberately optimized for softness or simply preferred the smoother texture, but the effect is undeniable. You crouch to sift a particularly stubborn batch, fingers brushing against gritty husks and dust. Some fringe accounts suggest that grains soaked briefly before grinding produced a slightly lighter flour, though evidence is minimal. You test this by rolling a pinch between your palms, feeling subtle differences. Slightly lighter, almost cloud-like, yet still robust enough to hold its shape. Even tiny adjustments in moisture, pressure, or rotation seem to have significant effects on the finished dough. Grinding was also a social event. Women, elders, and children rotate around the stones, exchanging quiet laughter, gentle teasing, and soft instructions. You join in, letting the rhythm of movement and chatter synchronize with the physical motion. You lift a handful of finely ground emmer, let it fall slowly into a basket, and notice the contrast between grains that barely yielded and those pulverized into powder, so soft it clings lightly to your skin. Fringe historians suggest that some households developed proprietary grinding techniques, closely guarded like a family treasure, an idea that sparks both skepticism and delight. Water is sometimes added at this stage, though sparingly. You sprinkle a few drops on a sample batch to test texture and moisture absorption. The flour swells slightly, grains plumping with potential. The tactile feedback is immediate, almost conversational. Too dry, and the dough will resist. Too wet, and it will sag. Historians still debate whether the Nubians intuitively mastered this balance or relied on oral traditions handed down through generations, but standing here, it feels like both. As the sun arcs higher, your arms ache slightly from the grinding, but the satisfaction is tangible. You scoop another handful, noting subtle differences in aroma, feel, and color. The sifting baskets glow faintly in sunlight, soft flour cascading like powdered sand, waiting patiently for its transformation. Even the coarser remnants, often discarded or reserved for flatbreads and porridges, carry the same ancient energy, a whisper of survival and ingenuity. You pause, fingers coated in fine flour, inhaling the gentle scent. Each stone, each basket, each rhythmic motion connects you to centuries of Nubian bakers whose persistence and tactile wisdom created the foundation for a soft and enduring bread. And in that quiet moment, you understand. The alchemy of grinding and sifting is not merely mechanical. It is a dance of patience, touch, and observation. The first critical step in coaxing tenderness from a desert determined to harden everything it touches.
Water is life in the desert, and for Nubian bakers, it is the quiet miracle that transforms coarse flour into supple dough. You approach a shallow basin, its surface catching the sun like liquid gold, and feel the heat radiate up through your fingertips. Each drop counts here. Too little, and the dough crumbles like dry clay. Too much, and it sags, losing shape and strength. Historians still argue whether certain water rituals were purely practical or carried hidden symbolic meaning. But for you, the weight of every drop is palpable, almost reverential. You dip your fingers into the cool liquid, testing temperature and mineral content. Some bakers prefer water drawn from the Nile itself, claiming the sediment and minerals contribute to elasticity and flavor.
Fringe accounts whisper of tiny inclusions of crushed herbs or leaves, soaked briefly to subtly condition the dough, though proof remains scant. You let a few drops run over your palm and watch as it beads, almost dancing before sinking into the flour, the moment delicate and almost meditative. Adding water is not a rush. You notice the older bakers working slowly, almost as if coaxing the flour to trust them. They pour in tiny amounts, fold gently, press and knead just enough to bring the grains together. It is tactile communication. Each handful responds differently. Each batch has its own quirks. The desert, after all, has moods, and the flour seems to reflect them. Scholars debate whether ancient Nubians consciously adapted to environmental variations or relied purely on instinct. But watching the dance unfold, you see a subtle genius in every measured motion. Sometimes water is collected from hidden pools or early morning dew, rare sources that might seem mystical. Fringe studies hint that dew-drenched flour absorbed differently, producing a lighter, more pliable dough, though historians caution against over-romanticizing. You splash a small puddle of dew water into your flour sample, folding it with care. The consistency changes almost imperceptibly, and you imagine generations of bakers experimenting in the same way, observing, learning, adjusting with patience bordering on obsession. You notice tiny gestures passed down as secret wisdom. A baker rubs a pinch of flour between fingers, checking how water integrates. Another forms a shallow crater in the mound to allow gradual absorption. Even children participating in the process mimic these motions, learning subtle skills that machines and texts cannot fully capture. Historians still argue whether ancient Nubians consciously adapted to environmental variations or relied purely on instinct. But watching the dance unfold, you see a subtle genius in every measured motion. Water interacts with the grains in fascinating ways. Millet swells slightly faster than sorghum, emmer more slowly, each responding to precise pressure, temperature, and fold sequence. Fringe theories suggest bakers may have even counted heartbeats or timed folds to achieve consistency. A charming, almost magical idea, though unverified. You knead slowly, feeling the dough's transformation under your palms, the gentle resistance giving way to a soft, pliable mass. The scent of wet flour rises, a faintly sweet, earthy aroma that feels like hope itself. The timing of water addition is subtle. Some bakers add small dribbles during initial mixing. Others fold in extra moisture midway through kneading. Even ambient humidity is considered, a factor historians still debate. Did ancient Nubians intuitively adjust for subtle environmental changes, or was it codified knowledge passed down orally? Standing in the sun, with sand shifting underfoot and the basin's water glinting, it feels like both. As the dough begins to take shape, you see the interplay of grains, water, and touch, an alchemy that is equal parts science and art. You remember the coarse millet that resisted grinding yesterday, now yielding smoothly, swelling gently under your palms. Fringe anecdotes mention sprinkling tiny amounts of date syrup or fermented liquid at this stage to encourage a lighter texture, though evidence is scant and debated. You do so experimentally, watching the dough respond with subtle elasticity, almost like it knows the gesture is meant to coax softness. The sun rises higher, the village buzzing faintly in the distance, yet here, kneeling by the water basin, time slows. You press, fold, and press again, each motion meditative, each drop of water crucial. Softness is coaxed into the dough not through haste, but through attentiveness, patience, and intimate understanding of the materials at hand. By the end of this slow ritual, the dough rests pliable and forgiving, a desert-hardened miracle transformed.
The dough sits quietly now, a warm, malleable promise of bread. But the real magic begins with fermentation. You kneel beside the resting mound, fingers brushing the soft surface, feeling tiny bubbles form beneath the skin, a delicate, almost imperceptible proof that life is awakening. Fermentation in Nubian bread is not a hurried process. It is slow, patient, and carefully monitored. Historians still argue whether the Nubians fully understood the microbiology behind it or relied entirely on observation and instinct. But the results speak for themselves. You watch an older baker retrieve a small jar containing remnants of fermented dates from yesterday, the liquid amber glowing in the morning light. A few drops are folded into the dough, introducing wild yeast that will gently coax the gluten to stretch and relax. Fringe accounts suggest that bakers sometimes added beer residue or even fermented milk to encourage a lighter texture, though scholarly consensus remains unsettled. You pour cautiously, kneading the mixture gently, marveling at how a few drops of liquid can change the behavior of the entire dough. Time seems to stretch. You press a finger into the dough, leaving a shallow indentation that slowly begins to fill in. This responsiveness signals proper fermentation. Some bakers whisper instructions to the dough, a habit that seems more superstition than science. Yet the rhythm of words and hands together creates a gentle mindfulness that no scholar has explained. You hum along with them, almost unconsciously, letting the cadence guide your touch. Fringe historians have charmingly speculated that sound vibrations could influence yeast activity, though evidence is speculative at best. But here it feels plausible in the hush of the desert morning. Temperature and environment play subtle but decisive roles. Dough is often placed near sun-warmed stones or under linen cloths that trap gentle heat while protecting it from the drying wind. You tuck the mound carefully, pressing slightly to shape and shield it. Historians still argue whether these coverings were purely practical or carried symbolic meaning, perhaps a blessing for softness, but you feel the wisdom in this gentle care. Even the smallest fluctuation in heat or humidity could change the texture, leaving bread tough instead of tender. You notice the dough's aroma evolving as it rests. Initially faint, a mild, earthy scent of flour and water, it gradually develops a slightly sweet, fermented note that hints at the final loaf's depth. Fringe accounts describe ancient bakers sniffing the dough to judge readiness, a skill both intuitive and highly trained, while historians debate whether smell was a primary indicator or an auxiliary confirmation. You lean close, inhaling, and feel a strange intimacy with centuries of bakers who did exactly the same, their noses and instincts guiding them through trials now invisible to modern eyes. Some households employ unique fermentation methods. A few incorporate tiny amounts of previously baked breadcrumbs or even residual oven smoke particles to encourage a lighter crumb. Scholars debate whether these were conscious experiments or happenstance discoveries, but the diversity in techniques is undeniable. You knead gently, integrating the tiny additions, feeling the dough relax under your palms. Each fold, each press encourages gas pockets to form, softening the structure and creating a tender interior that will defy the desert heat once baked. You watch as children help fold and shape smaller portions, learning through touch and repetition. The process is tactile education, every poke and press teaching them patience and sensitivity. Fringe historians suggest that early experimentation with wild yeast may have originated from such playful curiosity, a charming thought that highlights the human dimension of culinary evolution. The dough responds to every touch, every fold, growing more elastic, lighter, almost buoyant under your palms. As the sun climbs higher, the mound has transformed into a living, pliant mass. You marvel at the subtle alchemy, flour, water, yeast, and patient hands collaborating to create softness in a climate designed to harden everything. You remember the riverbank clay ovens from earlier, the careful grain selection, the meticulous grinding, and realize that fermentation is the pivotal bridge connecting all those preparatory steps to the miracle of baked bread. Finally, as the dough rests in its warm, linen-covered nook, you pause, noticing the gentle rise, the faint sheen of moisture, and the promise of tenderness that awaits. Historians still debate whether Nubians fully conceptualized the science behind these transformations, but perhaps the more important truth is that through careful observation, inherited wisdom, and patient touch, they achieved results that remain remarkable even by modern standards. The dough, once simple grains and water, is now alive, soft, and ready to embark on the next stage of its desert journey toward shaping, molding, and ultimately baking into bread that could defy the sun itself.
You roll up your sleeves, feeling the warm dough beneath your palms, and step into the next ritual, kneading. This is where patience meets tactile mastery, a slow, deliberate dialogue between your hands and the living dough. You press, fold, and turn, sensing resistance give way to elasticity, a pliancy that promises loaves soft enough to survive hours in the desert sun without turning to rock. Historians still argue whether Nubians measured kneading time with precision or relied purely on feel, but standing here, intuition seems as powerful as any watch or sundial. The rhythm of kneading is hypnotic. You press with the heel of your hand, fold the dough over itself, rotate, and repeat. The texture gradually changes, becoming smoother, almost silky, and faint bubbles begin to appear on the surface. Fringe sources suggest that bakers sometimes whispered soft words or hummed to their dough, a practice thought to encourage elasticity through vibration or simply calm repetitive motion. You join in, humming a low, lazy tune, and the dough feels almost responsive, pliant and alive beneath your palms. Every fold and press is measured with pauses to observe texture and moisture. You sprinkle tiny increments of water as needed, feeling how each drop integrates. Millet reacts differently than sorghum or emmer, swelling at its own pace, demanding subtle adjustments. Scholars debate whether these nuanced observations were systematically codified or transmitted as informal oral tradition, but their efficacy is clear. Under skilled hands, even the harshest desert grains yield a tender, forgiving dough. You notice the communal aspect of kneading. Elders guide children, hands meeting, folding, and pressing in tandem. You mimic the motions, feeling centuries of practice distilled into instinctive gestures. Fringe anecdotes suggest that small amounts of fermented liquid or even beer residue were folded in during this stage to encourage air pockets and a softer crumb, a method debated but occasionally referenced in ancient texts. You add a few drops experimentally, marveling at how the dough's texture subtly shifts, almost as if acknowledging the gesture. Temperature is critical. The desert sun warms the air and your hands impart gentle heat to the dough. Bakers adjust timing and pressure accordingly, sometimes kneading in the shadow of walls or under linen to control ambient warmth. Historians still argue whether this was a conscious adaptation or a natural byproduct of working outdoors, but the results are undeniable. Dough remains pliable and resilient, resisting the dryness that could easily turn it brittle. You press deeper into the tactile experience. Fingers sink slightly, lift, rotate, and press again, discovering hidden elasticity, subtle differences in resistance, and the gentle hum of life within the dough. You notice tiny air bubbles forming, signaling that yeast is at work, and you smile at the almost imperceptible miracle under your hands. Fringe sources hint that some bakers would even knead with bare feet to feel the mass more intimately, though scholars remain skeptical. Yet the idea is charming and somehow believable in this patient, tactile world. The rhythm continues, slow and steady, punctuated by pauses to observe, smell, and adjust. You detect a faint fermented aroma mingling with the earthiness of grains, a sensory promise of soft, resilient bread to come. Each fold incorporates tiny pockets of air, essential for softness while ensuring structural integrity. Historians debate whether ancient bakers consciously understood gluten development or relied on centuries of observational knowledge, but either way, the results are unmistakable. As kneading draws on, the dough becomes pliant, smooth, and springy, a living testament to patience and skill. You can feel the transformation, each press a negotiation with the desert itself, coaxing softness from a place that prefers hardness. By the time you step back, palms dusted with fine flour, the dough rests on a cloth-covered table, ready for shaping and molding. You remember the grinding stones, the careful grain selection, the precise water addition, and realize kneading is the bridge connecting raw materials to the miraculous softness of Nubian bread, a rhythm repeated across centuries that defies time, temperature, and terrain.
The dough rests briefly, yet you know the next step, shaping and molding, is just as critical for ensuring the softness will survive the desert's heat. You scoop a portion gently, feeling its elasticity under your fingers, and begin to form it into discs, ovals, and thick loaves. Each shape affects baking time, heat distribution, and ultimately texture. Historians still argue whether certain forms were functional, ceremonial, or simply aesthetic, but standing here, every fold and curve feels purposeful. Flat discs are easiest to bake quickly, their surfaces crisping slightly while interiors remain tender. You flatten one in your palms, noting how even pressure encourages uniform thickness, while a gentle flick of your wrist rounds the edges. Fringe accounts suggest bakers sometimes pressed small patterns into dough with carved sticks, swirls, dots, or zigzags to enhance airflow or identify households, though scholars debate whether these designs were practical or purely decorative. You trace a finger along a tiny spiral, imagining centuries of bakers leaving similar marks, a subtle signature baked into history. Thicker loaves require more care. You pinch, fold, and roll, creating rounded shapes that trap heat more effectively and protect the soft interior. You notice small cracks forming at the edges and gently smooth them, coaxing the dough into obedience. Historians still argue whether certain shaping methods encouraged better gas retention or if they were simply habit and tradition passed down orally. Regardless, the transformation is tangible. Dough that once lay pliable in a mound now holds a promise of structured softness, resilient enough to endure the oven's embrace. Children help by forming miniature loaves, learning through touch and repetition. Some fringe accounts claim that small participants were believed to bring good energy to the dough, a superstition scholars treat lightly but charmingly. You join them, laughing quietly as tiny hands poke and press, shaping imperfect but promising bread. The social ritual of shaping is as important as technical precision, blending tactile skill with communal rhythm, creating an almost hypnotic flow in the workshop. You notice the importance of symmetry and evenness. Dough too thin in one section risks overbaking. Too thick, and it may stay doughy in the center. You gently roll and pat, observing every nuance, ensuring balance. Scholars still debate whether ancient Nubians fully understood heat dynamics or if they relied on generational intuition, but the careful attention is undeniable. Even small gestures, a twist of the wrist, a pinch of the edges, a gentle indentation, affect the final texture in subtle but measurable ways. Patterns and indentations also guide steam release. You press shallow lines across a flatbread, encouraging even puffing, and imagine bakers centuries ago performing the same motion, balancing art and function. Fringe texts describe miniature vents carved in loaves to prevent bursting, a practice still debated, but oddly plausible. You pause, feeling the dough spring back gently under your fingers, the texture resilient yet yielding, a tactile promise that the oven will work its magic without destroying the delicate interior. The process continues with rhythm and patience. You lift loaves, rotate them in your palms, and place them carefully on linen-lined trays. The contrast of smooth exterior and tender interior is palpable. You think of the desert sun outside, unrelenting, yet held at bay by centuries of innovation and skill. Every curve, every fold, every swirl in the dough is intentional, a testament to hands that learned over generations how to negotiate softness in a place that otherwise hardens everything it touches. By the time shaping concludes, trays of promising loaves sit ready, each with subtle distinctions in size, texture, and pattern. You step back, dusting flour from your palms, and admire the transformation. Grains and water, once raw and unformed, now shaped into structures designed to survive heat, time, and the desert's drying winds. You remember the careful fermentation, the kneading, the precise hydration, and realize shaping is the final tactile negotiation before the oven claims the dough, translating patience and touch into miraculous softness.
Now comes the moment where patience, touch, and preparation meet fire. Baking. You approach the low clay-domed ovens, feeling the residual heat radiating from last night's embers. The scent of charred clay mingles with faint traces of smoke and dust, grounding you in centuries of tradition. Historians still argue whether the dome shape was strictly functional or held symbolic significance, but standing here, its efficiency is undeniable. Heat distributes evenly, embracing each loaf without overwhelming it. You slide a tray of shaped dough carefully into the oven, feeling the warmth lick your fingers through the cloth. Fringe records suggest that some bakers sprinkled tiny amounts of water on the oven floor before inserting bread, creating steam to soften the crust, a technique debated among scholars, but seemingly effective. Immediately, the aroma of wet flour, rising yeast, and gentle caramelization begins to fill the air, subtle yet intoxicating. Temperature management is subtle and precise. The oven is preheated with small wood fires, carefully monitored as embers are adjusted or added. You notice that some bakers insert a thin stick or stone to gauge heat by touch or smoke color. Historians still argue whether these methods were intentional scientific measures or evolved instinctual practices, but their effect on softness is undeniable. Too hot, and the crust hardens prematurely. Too cool, and the interior remains dense. You check on a loaf sliding toward the oven floor, watching it rise and expand, the exterior forming a gentle golden brown skin. Fringe anecdotes hint that some bakers placed small herbs under the bread, or even rested loaves atop heated stones to improve texture, though documentation is sparse. The subtle manipulation of airflow, heat, and placement is almost alchemical. Centuries of trial and error encoded into every gesture. Steam is the secret ally here. As moisture escapes from the dough, the crust forms gradually, locking softness inside. You remember the careful water measurement from earlier stages, the elastic kneading, the gentle shaping, all culminating in this precise moment where dough transforms into bread without losing tenderness. Scholars debate whether Nubians fully understood the physics or relied purely on empirical observation, yet the results endure. Children peek through small oven openings, marveling at the rising loaves. Some fringe accounts suggest that playful observation or quiet chanting during baking was believed to encourage fluffiness, though historians regard this as charming superstition. You smile at their wide eyes, imagining bakers centuries ago enjoying the same simple wonder, watching loaves swell and breathe in the warmth. The loaves shift slightly as heat envelops them, and you notice subtle signs, a gentle crackle, a faint golden sheen, a soft expansion that tells you the interior is remaining tender. Each movement of your hand, each adjustment of embers influences the final texture. Scholars still debate which factors, oven design, grain type, hydration, or ambient humidity matter most, but here, every element is alive, responsive, and critical. After several minutes, you carefully extract a loaf with a thick, cloth-protected paddle. The exterior is firm yet supple. You press lightly and feel a gentle spring, promising a soft, airy interior. The aroma is intoxicating, faintly nutty, faintly sweet, a whisper of fermentation, sun, and centuries of patient hands. Fringe sources mention that bakers occasionally tested loaves with a small finger poke before fully removing them, ensuring heat penetration and tenderness, a practice still debated but undeniably meticulous. The baking process continues with a slow rotation of trays, minor adjustments of embers, and careful observation. Each loaf receives a slightly different touch, ensuring uniform softness despite individual grain quirks. You pause, inhaling the rich scent of transformation, recognizing that heat here is not a threat, but a collaborator, coaxing out the softness embedded by preparation, kneading, and shaping. By the time the ovens are quiet, trays of golden, tender loaves rest in the shade, a desert-hardened triumph of touch, intuition, and careful fire management. You step back, dusting flour from your palms, and feel a profound respect for the generations of bakers who perfected this slow alchemy. Soft bread in a place that relentlessly tests everything it touches.
Loaves emerge from the oven, warm and fragrant. Their surfaces golden, slightly cracked, and irresistibly inviting. You lift one carefully, feeling the gentle spring beneath your fingers, a tactile promise of softness that has endured the desert's heat. Historians still debate whether Nubians consciously engineered every step to preserve this tenderness or relied on generations of practiced intuition, but the result is undeniable: bread that defies its environment. You set a few loaves on linen-covered trays, noticing subtle differences between them. Flat discs boast slightly crisper edges but remain tender inside, while thicker rounds hold a springy resilience, almost buoyant under your palms. Fringe accounts describe bakers tapping loaves lightly to gauge internal texture, a practice whose scientific validity is debated, yet it seems to produce remarkably consistent results. You imitate the motion, delighting in the soft echo beneath your fingertips. The cooling process is surprisingly delicate. Loaves must avoid sudden drafts, which could toughen crusts, yet still need airflow to prevent sogginess. You position trays near a shaded area, letting gentle wind caress the bread. Scholars argue whether ancient Nubians understood these thermodynamic principles or merely relied on observation and tradition, but the loave's uniform softness suggests a sophisticated empirical knowledge. Children gather around, eagerly tearing small pieces from the ends, and you smile at the spontaneous communal joy. Fringe historians suggest that tasting by the young ensured ongoing quality control, an informal but surprisingly effective practice. Each bite releases a faintly sweet, nutty aroma, slightly chewy yet airy, a tactile testament to the hours of preparation and care. You remember the grinding stones, the careful water measurements, the kneading, shaping, and baking, all culminating in this ephemeral yet enduring reward. Storage is equally meticulous. Bread intended to last beyond a single meal is placed in shallow baskets covered with linen to preserve moisture while protecting from sand and insects. You notice subtle differences. Thicker loaves stay soft longer, while thinner ones are best consumed quickly. Historians debate whether Nubians fully grasped the chemistry of moisture retention or relied on observation and tradition, but their methods are undeniably effective. You handle a loaf intended for travel, pressing lightly to confirm softness, noting the faint spring that resists but never hardens. Fringe sources hint that bakers sometimes rubbed a little oil or fat on the crust for storage to prolong tenderness, though evidence is sparse. You experiment with a gentle swipe, feeling a subtle sheen. Imagine how desert merchants might carry these loaves across dunes, still soft hours later. Evening descends, the sun casting long shadows over the village, and you notice how the community gathers around trays of bread, sharing stories, laughter, and crumbs. The social rhythm is inseparable from the culinary one. Every step of production involves observation, instruction, and shared experience. Scholars still debate the extent to which these communal interactions influence technique, but their cultural significance is clear. Finally, you break a loaf in half, watching soft steam rise, feeling the pliant interior yielding effortlessly. Fringe accounts suggest that bakers occasionally pressed small indentations post-baking to allow additional airflow and prevent condensation, a subtle trick debated among historians, but charming nonetheless. The bread's texture, aroma, and warmth tell a story of generations, of patient observation, and of a desert community's ingenuity. By nightfall, trays of soft, golden loaves rest across the village, ready for meals, travel, or ritual. You pause, fingers brushing crumbs from your palms, marveling at the journey. Grains harvested, ground, sifted, hydrated, kneaded, shaped, and baked, all with the singular goal of achieving enduring softness in an unforgiving environment. This is the quiet triumph of human patience, touch, and inherited wisdom, visible in every tender loaf, fragrant and resilient, a small miracle shaped by centuries of care.
Night falls, and the village quiets into a gentle hum of crickets and distant river water. You sit beside the remaining loaves, feeling the soft, cool surfaces beneath your fingertips, and reflect on the full journey. From sun-baked fields to the clay oven, every step, grain selection, grinding, sifting, hydration, kneading, shaping, and baking, was designed to coax softness from an environment that seems to harden everything. Historians still debate whether Nubians fully grasped the science behind each stage or relied entirely on generations of observational wisdom, but the results speak for themselves. Bread resilient, tender, and fragrant in a desert that demands toughness. You break another loaf gently, inhaling the steam rising from its golden interior. Fringe accounts suggest bakers sometimes tapped loaves after cooling, listening for subtle tonal differences that indicated ideal moisture levels, a technique debated but strangely appealing. You hum quietly, testing the texture with a fingertip, feeling slight elasticity, and marvel at the delicate balance achieved. Every tiny adjustment in grain, water, kneading, and baking has converged in this moment, creating softness that seems almost miraculous. The communal aspect remains palpable. Families gather, hands meeting, sharing bread and stories. Children learn through participation, observing subtle gestures, how elders fold dough, feel temperature, or judge readiness by touch and smell. Historians still argue whether these interactions were primarily instructional or culturally symbolic, yet the social rhythm undeniably reinforces the culinary craft. Fringe sources even suggest that rhythmic chanting during communal meals might have been believed to settle the bread, a whimsical notion that delights but remains unproven. Storage and preservation are carefully managed even at night. Bread intended for later meals is covered lightly with linen, avoiding drafts that could harden the crust. Thicker loaves hold softness for longer periods, while thinner ones are best consumed quickly, teaching an intuitive sense of timing. You handle a loaf, pressing gently to test resilience, noticing the pliance and spring that tell you it will remain soft despite the desert air. Historians debate the precise methods, but the effectiveness is indisputable. You watch the interplay of heat retained in the clay ovens, the ambient desert humidity, and the gentle drying of the crust. Even as night cools the air, the bread maintains its tender interior, a quiet triumph of material knowledge and human care. You break off a small piece, letting it rest on your tongue. The texture light, almost cloud-like. The taste faintly sweet, earthy, and deeply comforting. Fringe accounts claim that some bakers incorporated tiny amounts of honey or date syrup post-baking to prolong softness, a practice debated yet charming to imagine. As your hands brush crumbs from linen, the quiet intimacy of the night sinks in. The rhythmic labor, centuries of trial and error, and patient observation coalesce in every loaf before you. You remember the grinding stones, the measured water, the elastic kneading, and the gentle shaping. Each act a conversation with the dough, the climate, and generations past. Historians still debate which techniques were accidental versus deliberate, but in this calm, under the desert stars, the answer feels irrelevant. Softness has been achieved, resilience cultivated, and tradition preserved. Finally, you let the last loaf rest beside you, feeling the cool desert breeze ruffle the cloth covering. The village hum fades into night, the faint scent of wheat, fermentation, and gentle smoke lingering in the air. Each loaf embodies centuries of human ingenuity, tactile wisdom, and communal patience, offering nourishment, comfort, and continuity. Even the smallest crumb tells a story of resilience and craft. The soft golden loaves remind you that even in harshest conditions, care, observation, and touch can transform the ordinary into extraordinary. You inhale deeply, letting the aroma anchor you to the quiet miracle of Nubian bread. Soft, enduring, and infused with history, a testament to hands that never ceased experimenting, observing, and perfecting. Wind down. Now take a deep breath and settle into the quiet. The ovens are empty, the grains are resting, and the village has succumbed to a gentle night. You trace the memory of your hands through every step. The rough stones of grinding, the pliant dough pressed and folded, the orm oven embracing tender loaves. Each movement has been deliberate, rhythmic, almost meditative, a reminder that patience can coax softness even in the harshest desert. The scent of freshly baked bread lingers, comforting and gentle. Imagine the warmth, the faintly sweet aroma of fermentation, and the subtle resilience of every loaf, carrying both nourishment and centuries of wisdom. You feel the tension of the day ease from your muscles, replaced by the calm satisfaction of creation. It is quiet, soft, and entirely yours to absorb. In this moment, the desert seems less imposing, softened by knowledge, touch, and care. Even the air, filled with faint grains of flour and memory, seems to hum a gentle lullaby. Every loaf you handled, every fold and press whispers a story of human ingenuity meeting nature's challenge with patience and tenderness. Now, close your eyes, let the aromas and warmth carry you further into calm, and allow the soft miracle of Nubian bread to linger in your mind. With each gentle breath, imagine resilience, patience, and history folding into you, guiding your mind toward rest.